Thank you, Gus. Thanks for being here. It's delightful to see you and terrific segue. I just want to make one wee announcement before we move forward. Just a reminder that next month on January 11th in 2025 already, Dr. Stephen Reed, professor of early modern Scottish history and culture at the University of Glasgow, will be with us to discuss the life and reign of James VI in Scotland. And so I hope you'll all be able to be with us next month for this very interesting presentation. And so now the moment we've been waiting for, Dr. Derek Patrick, we couldn't be more thrilled that you're here with us. And thank you very much for making the time. Dr. Patrick is a lecturer, School of History, University of St. Andrews, and he is going to speak to us on the Black Watch, and I believe he's probably the preeminent authority. So, Professor Patrick, I think we're ready to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks very much. What I'll do is hopefully...
And if everyone will please mute your microphones and dim your cameras. And there it is.
With a bit of luck, that should be working. I think you can see that, Connie. That's great. And look, I would just like to say thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. An absolute thrill and always a pleasure for me to talk about the Black Watch. What I thought I would do today, I talked to Connie about this, and we talked about the history of the regiment and also how that history then feeds into you mentioned identity and Scottish identity, but how the sort of the Highland regiments do feed into that identity, but also how it shapes my own research at the moment, which predominantly looks at the First World War. So I thought I would cover those topics. I'll be honest, we're talking about a regiment that's history stretches from 1739 to 2006. So there is a lot to get through. So please forgive me if it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully I'll touch on some of the main areas. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, I'd be delighted to try to answer those for you. But let's start. Here we are. So I thought I would say a little bit to begin with about my own connection to the regiment and my own interest in the regiment. And it really stems from my great-grandfather. While I'm Derek Patrick, my middle name is John. My father's name is John, and obviously we were named after my great-grandfather, John Patrick, who unfortunately was killed in action on the Somme in 1916. And really, from an early age, I was quite conscious of that fact, and I always wanted to learn a bit more about him. And so here he is here, here's the man here. I'm not entirely convinced if there's any family resemblance or not, but obviously a man of whom I'm very proud. Going back a number of years, here are two photographs. The one on my left is me visiting his grave for the first time. I think I probably was, I guess, 13 at the time. The second one is a more recent photograph from about 2016, I think, which was the last time I had a chance to walk the battlefields. But obviously the Black Watch, through a family connection and through other members of the family, has always been something that I've had quite an interest in. So our story starts really in, I suppose, 1724-25. And at that time, George Wade, and I'm sure you know George Wade for his road building endeavours in the Highlands, advocated raising Highland companies or independent Highland companies, well affected to the government, who would be used to basically disarm the Highlands, prevent depredations, and bring criminals to justice. And now, 1724, it wasn't the first time this had been mooted, and certainly Highland companies had been in existence from the late 17th century, but the whole project seems to gain traction from around 1724. And by the following year, by the 31st of May 1725, is when George I issues this warrant to raise 6 independent Highland companies in North Britain. Now, initially the companies were commanded by the Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser, But those of you, I'm sure you probably know this period quite well. Lord Lovat was suspected of Jacobite tendencies. Yeah, that was quite an accurate assessment, really. But Lord Lovat initially commanded the six companies, with other commanders coming from the Monroes, the Campbells, and the Grants. Now, not all of the recruits came from Whig clans or well-affected clans. Those recruited around Lochaber, for example, were almost certainly harboured perhaps Jacobite tendencies. But the six companies were raised, and General Wade was the one who gave the instruction to wear the same colour or the same set of tartan, sort of tartan. And from that point on, the Black Watch would wear the black government tartan, the dark tartan. And now, please forgive any Gaelic speakers. Please forgive me. My partner, my other half, is a Gaelic speaker, and she would be very critical of my pronunciation. But I'm Friachindu, the Black Watch, is the name by which they were known. Predominantly Gaelic-speaking Highlanders at this point in time. But by 1739, we see a change, and the six independent Highland companies who had been largely involved in policing the Highlands are formed into a regiment of the British Army. Now, the companies are expanded to 10 in number. The Earl of Crawford, who is better affected to the government, is given command, and the regiment are known as the 43rd. Now, in terms of order of precedence in the British Army, or Crawford's Highlanders, the regiments tended to take the name from the colonel, latterly Semple's Highlanders. And we'll come back to this later, but you can see family connections develop through these regiments. The Lord Semple, who commands the regiments in the 1740s, is an ancestor of the Lord Semple, who commands the 8th Battalion of the Black Watch in the Western Front in 1915. So some of these families have a long military tradition. Initially, the idea was that they'd only be Protestants, that they would be 25 years of age or under, not exceeding that certainly, and would be 5'7" at the very least. And by all accounts, they were quite a robust-looking shower of men who numbered 700. You get an artist's impression here from one of the uniform books from that period, giving you an idea of what the red-coated Highlander would look like. But you could argue that the Black Watch got off to a less than auspicious start. By 1743, the regiment is called South. Now, at this point in time, Britain were at war with Spain, were being drawn into the War of the Austrian Succession, and there are rumours that the regiment is going to be sent abroad to Flanders or possibly to the West Indies, which had a very unsavoury reputation at the time. They are called South ostensibly to be paraded for the king, but by that time the king has gone to Flanders along with the Prince Regent, and the men are left feeling a little disgruntled. The money is owed them, they're owed arrears of pay. They feel it's a bit of a slight that the king hasn't stayed around. They're reviewed by General Wade, but ultimately over 100 men of the regiment desert. They mutiny. They don't get very far before they're apprehended and brought back to London. But the upshot was three of the ringleaders, the two Macphersons, Samuel and Malcolm from Badenoch, and Farquhar Shaw, who you can see there from Rothiemurchus, are executed. They are executed. The remaining mutineers are divvied up to other regiments, divided to other regiments, some going to Georgia, some going to the Leeward Islands, Minorca, Gibraltar. But at that point, you could argue that the regiment's stock was not necessarily great. But things change quite quickly. And I'm going through this at quite a pace, but as I say, it's a long period to cover. A pamphlet, a typo there, sorry, should read Paris. This is taken from a French source. But the regiment really rehabilitate themselves and begin to develop that reputation that stands them instead, that really defines them at Fontenoy in May 1745. Now, Fontenoy is not a great success for the British, but the way that the Highland troops, the way that the Black Watch fight, the French refer to them as Highland Furies. And in the Sciech coming painting, you can see there, you can see the men sheltering behind a rise in the ground. They were ordered to lie flat to avoid the French musketry and cannon. The man we can see in the foreground is Monro Fowlis, the commanding officer. It's a very dramatic image and a very heroic stance. By all accounts, Fowlis did attract quite a lot of attention from French sharpshooters. I think the artist has been quite keen quite kind, sorry, to Fowlis. He was, by all accounts, quite a stout man, and had made it quite clear that if he'd lain down, he probably wouldn't have got up again. So he remained standing in the face of this French fusillade. But ultimately, the Black Watch really established that reputation for heroism, for courage, for stoicism that we come to see throughout the remainder of their life. And remember as well, this is a period, 1745. If you think about what's going on at home, you've got the Morier painting there of the Battle of Culloden, which again I'm sure you're all familiar with. But the reputation of the Highlanders in general was relatively low. These were men who were rebellious, who were rebels, they were uncivilized, they were Gaelic-speaking, barbaric savages from the north. Um, and so ultimately, the Highland regiments, in some respects, help the Highlands or help Scotland rehabilitate itself in the eyes of the Crown. It's not until 1749 that the regiment become known as the 42nd or the Gallant 42. Again, you'll know that some of the folk songs associated with that, but they are known as the 42nd for most of their life. They are given the royal title in 1758, the Royal Highland Regiment, the only Highland regiment to have that title. But from 1749, when one regiment is disbanded, the Black Watch move up one space in the order of precedence and are known as the 42. By 1758, and again, we're moving to North America now. We've seen service in the continent, we've seen service in Europe. We're moving to Ticonderoga. And I hasten to say I've never actually visited Ticonderoga. I do plan to at some point. I've never been able to any time I've been in the States. But the action at Ticonderoga and what they call the kind of French Indian Wars, the Black Watch are initially in reserve, but launched themselves headlong at the fortified, well-defended fort at Ticonderoga at the Glacis. And I think it's three times that the Abercrombie has to pull them back or order them to come back. They just won't leave it. They just attack constantly. And really that reputation for valor, for being intrepid, courageous, time and time again they charge at the enemies. They're climbing on the bodies of their dead to get over the parapet. And the losses are fairly horrific. 316 men killed and over 300 wounded, including the vast majority of the officers. But Ticonderoga is something that stands quite proud in the history of the regiment for the way that they actually conduct themselves on the battlefield. Follow their officers, charge the enemy to mind their honour for king and country. They really establish that reputation that they have, that they earn over their existence. And it's that reputation that often we see a change in terms of the reception or the attitude towards the Highlander. Now, this is jumping back a little to 1745, but this is a print from the Jacobite Rebellion. And we see Sonny in the Boghouse. Now, Sonny Scott is the embodiment of Scotland. He is very much your John Bull or Uncle Sam type character, but for Scotland. But here we have a Jacobite Sonny, and he's in a latrine, quite frankly. He's in a boghouse. And, this is a play in the fact that Sonny gazes with wondering eyes, then down each vent hole thrusts his brawny thighs and squeezing cries, Sonny's a laird. It's really hammering this idea that these men are so uncivilized, barbaric, that they don't know how to use a basic amenity. But if we go forward, think about Fontenoy, think about Ticonderoga. This print comes from the Scottish Catholic Archives from 1779. And this is an attempt to extend toleration to Roman Catholicism. And we can see it being brought north to Scotland over the River Tweed, as it appears in the image here. But the man who's defending this, the man who's standing against it, is Sonny. Again, the same Sonny. But this time, he's a very, very different character. The characteristics, they're very different. He is the man who's defending the Articles of Union, the claim of right, the Protestant succession against the spread of Catholicism. And if you compare both figures, on the left or my left, we've got Sonny in 1745, the almost kind of Neanderthal look, the barbaric, Highland soldier. But if you compare him to the 1770s version, here we have for all intents and purposes, if you colour that image and give him a red jacket, this is a Highland soldier. This is a potentially a member of the Black Watch, and the reputation has gone some almost a 360 turnaround, and they really have rehabilitated themselves in the eyes of the country. The famous red hackle that I'm sure again you're familiar with, there's a bit of dubiety associated to this because it was almost certainly presented to the regiment in 1795 at a parade in Hertfordshire. And the idea being that it was for gallantry at the Battle of Geldermalsen, but the likelihood is it's not. That's a coincidence. Certainly by 1822, the army order comes through saying that the Black Watch had the exclusive right to wear the hackle. But it has been argued by Jack Stewart, by John Stewart, that the likelihood is the Black Watch were wearing red hackles long before 1795, and it probably stems from their service in North America. Now, whether they were inspired to wear this because of their experience with Native Americans, I genuinely don't know. But the likelihood is that they had been wearing the red hackle for some years. But from 1822, it becomes very much the exclusive preserve of the regiment and something that's instantly recognisable as being a emblematic symbol of the Black Watch. And really now, the reputation, the stock in the regiment is very, very high. And it does nothing but it soars during the Peninsular Wars. The Black Watch, the image here, the Black Watch at bay, shows a group of the Black Watch surprised at Quatre Bras the day before Waterloo by French lancers and cuirassiers. But they fight very hard. They suffer casualties at both Quatre Bras and Waterloo. But by the end of the Peninsular Campaign against Napoleon, you've got a clutch of battle honours. Corunna, Bissacco, they'd fought in Egypt with Abercrombie at Alexandria. The reputation of the regiment is sky high. It's through the roof. I suppose one interesting anecdote, it's said that after the Battle of Quatre Bras, the French cuirassier wore a steel breastplate, and some of the men of the regiment had acquired these from the battlefield and were using them over fire to cook their dinner, using it as a rudimentary ad hoc frying pan. And some of the French prisoners who saw this had assumed that they were cannibals, because of eating the bodies of the dead. But whether that was true or not, I don't know. It's a great story and probably adds to that kind of fearsome reputation that they enjoyed. But I think really the whole thing about the Black Watch, Highland regiments, Highland dress, the thing that really gives it royal approval, or gives it that kind of kudos, is royal approval. And that really comes with George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822. Now, this whole thing is conceived by Walter Scott, ably assisted by David Stewart of Garth. Now, David Stewart of Garth is a former Black Watch officer who had served in the Peninsular Wars, but it really helps to embed or to make the kilt and Highland dress synonymous with Scottish identity. Now, this had been a gradual process with the work of Walter Scott, the artists like Raeburn and things like this, who extolled the virtues of the Highlands. But royal approval went some way to change this. And really, much of the tartans, the kilts, etc., that we know today, the sets of the tartans, owe their existence in this period. The historian Edward Spears describes it as an extravaganza of tartan, and he's not far wrong. Here you've got a painting, Wilkie's painting of George IV. Again, the issue here is George basically, by all accounts, again, quite a robust man, I would say, wore pink tights under his kilt, which you don't really see in the representation there. But that's only enhanced when Queen Victoria, when Prince Albert acquires Balmoral in 1852, I think, and Victoria obviously her affinity and connection to the Highlands is very marked. And this again helps promote the adoption of Highland culture, Highland dress, Highland norms by Lowland Scots. And the connection that Victoria enjoys or has with her Highland soldiers really enhances the reputation of the Highland soldier tenfold. They really become the poster boys of empire, if you like. And throughout the wars of empire, the Crimean War, here are a couple of Robert Gibb paintings of the Black Watch, comrades, showing this man standing guard over his fallen comrade. The painting itself very reminiscent of representations of the French army's retreat from Moscow, that type of thing. Or Gibb's painting of the storming of the Alma Heights, the Highland Brigade, leading the charge up the Alma. The Sir Arthur Hackett carrying the colours there is a fellow fifer. His home is not too far from where I am at this moment in time. Certainly the Highland Regiment who who come out of the Crimea with the best reputation are the old 93rd, the Sutherland Highlanders, for the Thin Red Line at Balaclava. This is another fantastic Gib image, and while he tends to embellish the fact that the Russian cavalry are brought far closer to the line than they ever actually came, but this reputation for valor, for courage, for stoicism, bravery, sacrifice, all these things, all these adjectives that you could roll into this, they really are endorsed, are rubber stamped by service in the Crimea. And I absolutely love this painting. It's a fantastic image and representation of the Highland soldier. But the Black Watch go on to serve in the Crimea. They serve in Indian Mutiny with some distinction. You see Colour Sergeant Gardner, who won the Victoria Cross in the Indian Mutiny. The heavy beard is a legacy of the Crimean War, where the men were allowed to grow beards due to the fierce winter. Lieutenant Farquharson in the middle there winning the VC at Lucknow. And on the end, Samuel McGaw, who was one of the soldiers who won the Victoria Cross at the Battle of Amafal, sorry, in 1873-74 on the Gold Coast of Africa, fighting against the Ashantis in, I think, what is now Ghana. So the Black Watch really play a major part in these wars of empire. And again, if you're looking for a representation of the Highland soldier, de Neuville's representation of the Black Watch and the Seaforths storming the Egyptian trenches at Tel El Kebir, it was no coincidence that war artists and war correspondents followed the Highland Regiment, because the red coat, the tartan, the skirling pipes, the flashing broadswords, all of these things add an element of colour to what could potentially be fairly drab battlefields. But the Black Watch fight with distinction at Tel El Kebir. But it's not all sweetness and light, if I put it that way. 1884, the Black Watch fight in the battles of El Teb and Tamai. Tamai on the 13th of March, 1884. This is a representation from the Penny Illustrated. It shows some of the ferocity, the hand-to-hand fighting, essentially bayonets, claymores, fists in some cases. This was when the Black Watch were involved in the breaking of the square. Now, this was a great source of derision. Other regiments in garrison towns, it was still relatively common for someone to go to the bar if the Black Watch were garrisoned there and ask for a pint of broken square. And fists would fly and belts would be unleashed and so on. But the Black Watch were ordered to advance at Tamai, and they were surprised by the Sudanese who swept into the square. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem about it called Fuzzy Wuzzy, it was a source of some shame. Not that the Black Watch had anything to apologise for, but things didn't always go as planned on these Victorian battlefields. And much was the same when we get to the Boer War, and we're now moving towards, I suppose, what you would class as modern wars. The Boer War, the Black Watch take a very active role in the conflict, but the Battle of Makersfontein on the 11th of December 1899 is part of what they call it Black Week. There are three fairly serious setbacks at Colenso, Stormberg, and Makersfontein. And at Makersfontein, the Black Watch, leading the Highland Brigade, are surprised. Reconnaissance was perhaps not what it should have been, and again, no fault of the regiment. But they advance, they assume that the Boers will be on the high ground. They're not, they're entrenched at the bottom. And there's confusion, it's dark, the muzzle flashes, and by the end of the day, the Black Watch have lost 7 officers and 88 men killed, and well over 207 wounded. 72% of the officers who take part in that action, roughly 40% of the other ranks are killed or wounded. And it's an absolute disaster, not only for the Black Watch and the Highland Brigade, but also Scotland, because this number of casualties on a Victorian battlefield are relatively unusual. And many homes around Dundee, Fife, Perth lose a loved one, a father, a son, at Makersfontein. This is a representation, sorry, by Catton Woodville. all that was left of them, the Black Watch after Magersfontein. The interesting thing is that despite reverses like Tamai or Magersfontein, the reputation of the regiment really is not tarnished. The reputation of the Highland soldier as the strapping six-footer, the big burly Highlander, it doesn't really change. And the focus moves away from those kind of skirling pipes and flashing broadswords to courage, to sacrifice, to stoicism, to endurance. And in some respects, the war artists like Catherine Woodville or correspondents who tend to follow the guns, who follow the Black Watch, um, that reputation is enhanced, if anything, by these military setbacks. We don't see any kind of slight on the regiment or the fighting prowess of these men. And some of you may well have seen the Black Watch Memorial on the Mound in Edinburgh, unveiled in 1910. It's an absolutely fantastic memorial. It's a really, really impressive one. If you do get the chance, it's quite interesting to look at the casualties on the side, because the thing with the South African conflict was the fact that far more men died as a consequence of disease than actual enemy action. The names are emblazoned on the side. You can see them roughly in that first photograph. But just to give you an idea of how the reputation of the Highland soldier, it develops over this period, their significance for empire, the fact that they not only become synonymous with Scotland and the Scottish martial prowess, they become synonymous with Britain and empire. This is an illustration from Chicago, actually, the Battle of Belmont in 1899. Now, I know everyone's muted, but the question I would have asked you would be how many regiments or how many Highland regiments do you think were at the Battle of Belmont? Well, the answer to that one is none. There were no Highland regiments there, and they certainly were not dressed like this. Even the British Army would not send men forward wearing red coats and attacking this fashion. But for the producers of this print, if you want to represent the British Army, what better than to use a Highland soldier? The image, the reputation was so entrenched, so significant. It has significance far beyond Scotland. If you think about the diaspora and you think about South Africa, you think about the States, you think about Canada, this is an image that resonates far, far beyond Scotland, Britain. It does go, it translates quite some distance. This just another example of this. This was the masthead of a print, an illustrated magazine that was introduced in 1900 called Under the Union Jack, and it represents the naval strength of Britain in the background, the colonials, the Indian Army, but the very forefront of this spearhead, you've got the Highland soldier, you've got the kilted soldier. I think it speaks volumes as to their significance. But in some respects, what I would like to say for the second part is go on to look at how that reputation enhances recruitment or shapes recruitment in the First World War, which is an area that I've spent some time researching. And I can't claim to give you a definitive answer or any definitive answers today. This is very much a work in progress. But I just wanted to draw your attention to the reforms in the British Army in 1881, when all regiments were given a formalised local recruiting district. And while it did make those regiments synonymous with those areas, and local regiments, family regiments. I'm from Perth, the old barracks in Perth. At one time, it was not unusual to see Black Watch soldiers walking around town, and there was a real affinity between local communities and their regiments. And you can see from the map there that the section marked in yellow, covering Fife, Perth, Dundee, and Angus, was very much Black Watch country. It's quite interesting that certainly by the 1850s, I would argue, the Black Watch are no longer predominantly Highland. The image you saw of the Sutherland Highlanders earlier, by the 1850s, they were almost certainly the last predominantly Gaelic-speaking regiment. They still had a large number of men recruited throughout Sutherland. The Black Watch recruited heavily from Fife, Perth, Dundee, and Angus, but also you find large numbers of Irishmen, etc., in the ranks at that point in time. But the Black Watch are associated with that area. But the interesting thing is that in time of crisis, like the First World War for that matter, they take on the reputation almost as the national regiment. There's something resonates with the Black Watch that makes that reputation extend or enhanced across a number of areas. This is from the Tatler, no less, on the 7th of October 1914. And every Scotsman glories in the Greys, the Gordons, the Cameronians, the 93rd, and many another proud regiment. But the Black Watch seems to stand out separate and distinct as the national regiment. And I think that's got some significance here. I think that's an important point to make. You know, they are invariably associated with that regimental recruiting area, but their significance or appeal is far broader. And in terms of the First World War, that reputation of the Highland soldier is very much entrenched, if you forgive the pun, you know, entrenched in the First World War. But the ladies from hell, um, Scots are great self-publicists, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but the Scottish regiments are very much like that too. Now, whether the Germans ever treated the Scots differently or viewed them differently is open to debate. This was an extract from a German magazine or a German paper who referred to the Black Watch as one of the best Highland regiments. The British sent the best they had to the front, the gallant Scots, their heroic bravery. But they tend to revel in this notion of the ladies from hell. It has been asked by Professor Benjamin Zeman whether or not that this reputation was earned, and whether or not it's simply a case of self-perception. Um, were the Scottish Highland soldiers, Celtic soldiers, feared or viewed any differently from the German opponents? He has gone through any number of German sources from that period and has really struggled to come up with evidence that they were viewed differently. But certainly Ernest Junger in Storm of Steel talks about fighting Scottish soldiers in March 1918 and does refer to them as being, you know, wearing kilts. And at that point, they knew they were fighting real men. So it's one of these areas that, you know, again, it's difficult to separate myth from reality. But were the Scots viewed differently during the Great War? I'm not sure. I think it was simply an extension of that reputation that they had earlier. But you do find references to the ladies from hell. You know, the best one I've heard was the Gordon Highlanders being referred to as the ballerinas of the Somme, which I thought was very picturesque. But whether it's true or not, it does resonate. And if you tell someone they are the best often enough, they will begin to believe it. Um, I just wanted to throw this in here. This is actually a medallion, a propaganda medallion produced by the Germans in 1915. And you can't really make it out that well from the image there, but it's Death is a Piper. And this likely comes out or produced after the Battle of Loos, which involved a large number of Scottish regiments. But it shows a skeletal piper, you know, death is a piper, this whole idea. So whether the Germans viewed the Scots differently, I'm not sure. But the whole ladies from hell idea, which is maybe a backhanded compliment in some respects, the Scots, the Highland soldiers certainly tended to revel in that as well. This is quite an interesting image. It's nothing, you know, of great significance artistically. This is a German cartoon or a German postcard from 1914, and I often wonder, it shows, you know, Germans advancing quite early in the war. The fact that they choose to portray their opponents as Scots, and we can see Indian soldiers here too, you know, in the foreground. Um, whether or not the Scots do have a special significance, the fact that they are on the losing side here, they choose to represent them as being on the losing side. I'm not entirely sure. Um, but you do tend to find often that the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, the Celtic fringe, if you like, are often, certainly in the Victorian period, lumped in with the Indians, the Gurkhas, the Sikhs, and so on, as a martial race. The Scots, the Celts are often viewed in that way, with this sort of, you know, Victorian pseudoscience that we find in the late 19th century. But whatever the truth and whatever the reality, the kilted soldier is still very much used by recruiting sergeants and recruiting posters to encourage men to enlist. You've got some of the more famous ones here. You know, your king and country needs you, your country's call. The central image there's one that I always I find quite interesting. It's obviously clearly a Scottish soldier, but the scene we have in the background with the thatched roofs and the rolling countryside, it looks much more reminiscent of an idealized English countryside as opposed to Scotland. But the kilted soldier is very much a useful recruiting tool. And not only on a national level, these are a couple of adverts taken from the Dundee Courier, recruiting for the local territorial battalion of the regiment. And you get this as a man. There's no doubt in this. If you want to be perceived as a man, you will join the regiment. You'll join the Black Watch. Pals kept together. Have a shot at it. DC Thomson were actually really good at these kind of localized recruiting campaigns and producing posters that encouraged men to enlist. Um, I suppose in some respects, ones that I find really interesting are these from 1914 and 1915, very much in the same theme. The King's Call to the right, both show Robert the Bruce, or a representation of Robert the Bruce. 1314, 1914, they make the link, the parallel between Bannockburn and 1914. 100,000 men wanted, and you've got Bruce here looking over his shoulder at Britannia as all ranks of society flock to the colours. It's the way that Bruce is represented here that I find quite interesting. It's very much Mel Gibson, Braveheart, kilts. It's the Highland image, the kilted image is even used or to portray Bruce here. This one not so much. The 1915 image not so much, but they use these great Scottish heroes to encourage men to join the colours. And these are both from fairly localised publications, one from Perth, one from Dundee. But I find them absolutely fascinating. And also, again, anecdotally, the Scots have this kind of warlike reputation. The image here shows troops of the Black Watch marching through France in 1914. The extract here is from, again, the Dundee Courier from 1914, and it's meant to be a fictitious account or a fictitious meeting between an English recruit to a Black Watch sergeant. And I'm not going to affect the accent here, I'm afraid, but the English recruit says to the sergeant he wants to enlist. And the sergeant asks which regiment, and he said the Black Watch. And he said, what nationality? He said, I'm an Englishman. And the sergeant says, well, why do you prefer the Black Watch? And he said, because I want to get to the fighting line at the front. Recruit accepted. So the Black Watch, kilted regiments, Scottish regiments more generally, do have that reputation that they will be in the fighting line, that they'll be at the front, and they'll be there, bearing the brunt of the action. I'm not going to read through all this. I've put this in here. You could perhaps look at it later if it's of interest. But there is a concern in Scotland that Lowland regiments are being overlooked in some respects. By April 1915, Lord Salverson and various other prominent members of society actually establish an organisation to look after the interests of the Lowland regiments because they have been overshadowed by the picturesque garb and accoutrements of their Highland cousins. And quite rightly, and not without some justification, it's argued that the Lowland regiments are the ones who actually represent national life in Scotland and the national qualities of Scotland in a much truer sense to the Highlands. And Salveson has a point here. And many of the old Lowland regiments, the Royal Scots, the first of foot, Pontius Pilate's bodyguard, as they were known, the Cameronians, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the 25th of Foot, all of these regiments predate and have precedence over the Highland regiments, but often run out, are often overlooked or overshadowed by their Highland counterparts. Going back to the Victorian period for a second, some of you may well have heard about the Heights of Dargai when the Gordon Highlanders take the Heights of Dargai. The colonel or the general asks who will take the Heights, and the colonel of the Gordons says the Gordons will take it. And that became a standing joke actually in gentlemen's clubs for a number of years afterwards when people said, don't leave your coat there, because the Gordons will take it. But the sticking thing, the thing that stuck in the throats of the King's Own Scottish Borderers, they'd actually taken the Heights of Dargai a few days earlier, but nothing was written about that. But the Gordons took it, and there was a great outpouring of celebration. So the Lowland regiments, not without some interest, or not without some justification, they are overlooked to an extent. But that's not to say, the popularity of the Black Watch was very, very clear. And this is an image actually at Perth, Old Perth Station, quite an unusual image of a Black Watch recruiting team in 1914, the pipe band in the background, who are out looking for recruits. And the Courier and Argus mentioned quite clearly the popularity of the regiment, pouring into the barracks in Perth. Men from America, from Canada, several came from South America, um, England, all parts of Scotland. The large number of Welshmen, it's never really been explained. I can't really get to the bottom of why so many Welshmen end up joining the Black Watch in 1914. It's quite a mystery. But and it's nothing to do with Scottish ancestry or descent in this case. But the Black Watch are hugely popular. And these are some of the men, that we can see joining. These are men from Coatbridge in Lanarkshire, which is well outside the regimental recruiting district, who joined the regiment on the 5th September 1914. The Boy Scouts pipe band or band in the front, they are not volunteers. They were simply there to play the men to the station. But these are some of the young men who joined the Black Watch in September, August, September 1914. Motivation for recruitment, it's not all about reputation. It's not all about, history, prestige, although that certainly comes into it. William Linton Andrews, who you can see on the right of the front row in this photograph, this is an image of what they call the fighter writers. These men were all journalists or editors with D.C. Thompson. They all joined the local battalion of the Black Watch. But Linton Andrews' book, Haunted Years, makes it quite clear that in some cases, it wasn't just down to patriotism and a rush to the colours that persuaded men to join. He talks about this sort of exchange outside the recruiting office when a gaunt man towers over him and he sort of says to him, are you out of work? And Linton Andrews has to tell him, well, no, I'm actually an editor for one of the local newspapers. I've got a good job. And this big chap then kind of pushes him to the back and says, look, make way for the lads without jobs. And from a practical point of view or an economic point of view, many men are joining the army because of that. When the war breaks out, industry initially contracts. The coalfields in Fife contract, men are made unemployed. The army are looking for manpower. There's a surplus of manpower in some of these areas, and therefore the economic incentives presented by the military persuade them to join. It's not just about the image of the Highland soldier. But for many it was. And this chap here, we can see Captain Darling in the Royal Scots. Before that, he had been a company quartermaster sergeant in the Black Watch. But Darling enlists in 1914 because he had this notion of being a Sir Galahad in the field, is how he described it. This is a man like many who've grown up on images of the Thin Red Line at Balaclava, the storming of the Alma Heights. He has a very romanticised notion, perhaps, of what war is. But that was soon knocked out of him when he goes to train. He had an ardent willingness to train for battle. September, October, we rose at dawn, formed forward, marched in columns, formed on the left, closed in platoon, and other manoeuvres ad infinitum. They did physical exercise. We ate what we got and how we got it. The glamorous life, sorry, that he imagined, that was dispelled fairly quickly. Darling's quite an interesting character. He was given quite senior non-commissioned rank because he was an educated man and consequently was good with numbers and therefore becomes the company quartermaster sergeant. But in reality, the regiment simply can't cope with the number of recruits. Normally, for the British Army, you've got a relatively small professional army who absorb a relatively small number of recruits every year. In wartime, you still have initially that very small professional army now having to absorb a large, huge number of civilian recruits. So logistically, what do you do for them? How do you equip them? And that was a problem. And K2 were the second of Kitchener's new armies. And they were described as being dressed in a red tunic, blue trousers, and a postman's hat. The lad we can see here, Marius Ferguson, came from Hawick, but he's wearing the early uniform pre being sent to France. But this was how many of these men had to train in the autumn of 1914. And this image here, this is based on research I've carried out over the last few months. And this looks at Black Watch volunteers, Black Watch recruits from the outbreak of war, 4th of August, right through to the tail end of 1914. And what we can see is this notion of a rush to the colours, that everybody rushes out to enlist in a wave of enthusiasm. That isn't really the case. And we don't really start seeing big numbers until the 30th of August or the end of August, beginning of September, because men had to make provision for their families. They had to look to their own civilian occupation, their civil occupations. patriotism plays a part, but recruitment in Britain for the Great War is quite a slow burner. It's been suggested that Scotland has two peaks in recruitment. It doesn't really show here. Well, to some extent, I suppose it does. But perhaps the first one was driven by the economic incentives I mentioned earlier. Latterly, it's more by what is going on in France and a determination to do your bit for king and country. The interesting thing, I think, is where these recruits come from. And here you can see Fife with over 1,000 recruits. Fife, you would expect, with the regimental district. Perthshire too, to an extent, with maybe 500. But if you look at Lanarkshire, the central belt, the industrialised central belt, not an area associated with the Black Watch, but you're providing well over 800 men in those opening months. But if you look at the rest, Argyll, Armagh, Ireland, you've got Carmarthenshire in Wales, you've got Cork, you've got Cumbria, virtually every part of the UK is covered by at least one volunteer, which kind of ties into this notion of them being a national regiment with a national reputation. It's difficult because I don't have any other figures from other regiments to compare them with. The Black Watch are very well served with surviving records. So it's a bit speculative, but interesting, I think, all the same. And you do get the idea here. This is based on the 9th Black Watch I'm going to talk about over the next 10 minutes or so, who were my great-grandfather's battalion. And if you look at the 9th Black Watch and where they came from, you can see Lanarkshire provides 249 men. This is a sample of over 800. Fife 137, Perthshire 10% or 85%, 85 men. The interesting thing too is that 10% of these men come from England and Wales. Most of the Englishmen come from Lancashire. Again, it's a difficult one as to why they come from Lancashire, but most of the recruits come from St Helens, Liverpool, that kind of area. But the general perception was that the men, the quality of recruits was very high indeed. And Major John Stewart, the second in command, described them very favourably in comparison to the old regular army, the 1st Battalion, not only as regards officers. And despite initial concerns about the new army that Stewart may have harboured, after seeing them in the trenches, he was quite confident. In his opinion, they would face anything. They had a reputation in the press. This is from the Scots Pictorial, which shows the 9th Black Watch, one of these war-raised battalions, as being quite sort of dandified, if you like, if that's a word. But the reality was they were very good recruits, and he took great solace in the fact that he hadn't seen a single man of our lot that wasn't shaved and properly clean after 10 a.m., even in the trenches. And obviously, I think we're all familiar with the conditions that men face in the trenches. That in itself is no mean feat. But the thing that I want to link it back to this idea of pre-war, that the reputation of these regiments, you've got to bear in mind, I think, the British Army taking in this wealth of recruits, civilian recruits. How did they forge them into soldiers? Well, in the British Army, a lot of it's done through these ideas of regimental tradition and regimental prestige. And the way we can see that, developing, this is a description of a riot in Aldershot, which seemed to be quite animated, I suppose, is the word you maybe look for. But we talked about the broken square at Tamai sometime earlier, but this is a period when a teacher, a draper, a miner, now a soldier in the Gordon Highlanders, goes into the bar and mentions the broken square at Tamai. And again, now a soldier in the Black Watch, who a few short months earlier had been a teacher, draper, miner, and so on, resents this imputation and challenges the Gordon Highlander to withdraw this assertion on behalf of the fame of long dead comrades. The whole idea of how these men absorb that identity and that military identity, that regimental identity, is played out here in Aldershot in 1914. You've got men who'd perhaps never thought of joining the army before, now prepared to fight, slug it out on behalf of comrades who had died in 1884 and the stain on the reputation, the regiment's honour. And the one thing that the key characters here are the sergeants. And I'll come back to this in a second. But most of the sergeants in the new army, certainly in the 9th Black Watch, are old regulars. Like Company Sergeant Major McCain here, you can see his Boer War ribbons on his chest. But the one thing that Darling mentioned was how these men absorbed this identity. And within a few short months, they had taken on this special identity, this special responsibility for something that, and this was something that they were prepared to fight for, and not only to fight for, but to die for. And as case would be in the case of the Ninth Black Watch, that for far too many of these men, that came to be a reality. These are the officers of the Ninth Black Watch shortly before leaving for France. This is probably around May 1915. The colonel, who's in the centre here, and Major Stewart, who's next to him, were two of the few officers who actually had any pre-war service whatsoever. The rest of these young subalterns were straight from the officer training corps. The men who had the experience were men like Regimental Sergeant Major Bedson, a very formidable character. Bedson described in his quiet and unostentatious way, busy inculcating into the new recruits the tradition and the pride in the regiment. I'm not entirely sure how many of you have maybe served in the army, but quiet and unostentatious is not a term or terms I would necessarily use to describe regimental sergeant majors. But the interesting thing with Bedson, when we talk about diaspora, this was a man who had, from a Scottish family, who had emigrated to Canada. He comes back from Fort Garry. He's born in Fort Garry. He comes back to Dundee, to Perth, enlists, joined the Black Watch. He's wounded at the Battle of Tellocabeir in 1882 before retiring after 21 years' service, and rejoins the regiment in his 50s, probably 54, I think, in 1914, and becomes Regimental Sergeant Major of the Ninth Black Watch. And he's not alone. You can't make out, unfortunately, this image is not the clearest. We can see Bedson at the front, but these are the sergeants of the battalion. And virtually every one of them has medal ribbons on his chest. These are old campaigners. And these are the men who serve in the regiment who really are tasked with not only training the new recruits, but making sure that they're aware of that lineage, that history, that pedigree that goes back all the way to 1739. And I just want to finish up by talking about the Battle of Lewes, which is where these men obtain their baptism of fire. Because the Battle of Lewes is often overshadowed. I'm not entirely sure if it's one you're hugely familiar with, but often overshadowed by the Somme and Passchendaele. But Lewes is very much a Scottish battle. 30,000 Scots take part on the opening day of the battle. Every Scottish regiment is represented, regular soldiers, territorials, men from the New Army, two New Army divisions. We tend to think of the New Army in the context of Britain in the First World War, fighting on the Somme on the 1st of July 1916. For the 9th and 15th Divisions, their real baptism of fire was the 25th September 1915. So 30,000 Scots representing virtually every community, every area, every town, every hamlet in Scotland has someone there. And it really is a Scottish battle. These are images that I took. This top one's from June 1915. It was spliced together. The one at the bottom I took on a recent trip to France, 2015, so 100 or so years apart. Dud Corner Cemetery, they're not exactly looking in the same direction. The ground over which the Ninth Black Watch attack is pretty much up the direction of which that bus is facing. The German redoubts that the men attack is at the back of those pillars over on the far side. But what you can see, and those of you who've toured northern France would be aware of the fact that the area is uniformly flat. It's very, very flat with some raised ground in the distance. It very, very much favours the defender. And the Ninth Black Watch will find that out to their cost. The ground at the attack starts with the first objective at the Longe Road Redoubt, into the village of Lewes, onto Hill 70 and beyond. And you can see here that the representatives of the 15th Scottish Division, the Camerons, the Gordons, the Seaforths, the Black Watch, they represent all the famous regiments, or many of the famous regiments that we would associate with Scotland. And in the first instance, between the Black Watch and the Redoubt, there's a distance between 80 and 200 yards. Not very far at all. There is some concern and some trepidation, as you would imagine. This is taken from Major Stewart, the second in command. It's taken from his diary. He was very concerned about the German wire being damned strong and it will take some crossing. I don't think there'll be much left of it when we get to work with our guns. The image there is taken from his scrapbook, which shows German wire after the battle. And he writes in the margin, not damaged. He's quite clear about this. The German wire is very strong and impenetrable in places. The men attack at 5:30 that morning. It's the first time that the British Army have used gas, really to compensate for a shortage of shells. They use gas, they use smoke candles to mask the attack. It's a horrible weapon, it's unpredictable, and in some cases it actually blows back into the British lines and causes casualties before they're even over the top. The two figures there, Colonel Lloyd, sorry, Major Stewart, are the two senior officers. Um, One lad from Perth sent a very detailed account to the local papers, and as they went over the top, his officer's last words were "Give them hell and remember the Lusitania," was what he shouted as they advanced. But bear in mind, they are piped into action. This is a Scottish regiment. We've not talked about pipes really in any great detail. This is the pipe band. The pipe band pipe the men into action. Every man in this photograph, apart from the colonel, who we could see seated to the left there, by all accounts, every other man in this photograph is killed or wounded on the 25th September 1915. The Pipe Major Brown to the right of the adjutant there, every one of these men killed or wounded. It's quite a sobering thought. But the pipes are integral to the life of the regiment, for the daily life of the regiment when they're not in action and when they're also in action. But they go over the top at 5:30, and by 17:25, 2 hours later, they're into the village of Lewes. But the cost was appalling. The cost was horrific. In the first 100 yards or so, the Ninth Black Watch lose 100 men killed, at least. Colonel Stewart, writing later, described it as a perfectly magnificent show. But alas, alas, it was only a remnant of a regiment. This is a regiment that he and the colonel have basically taken a year, more or less a year to build, has effectively been dismantled in the space of a few hours. The fighting in the village, which you can see here, is intense. The high ground there, not that it's particularly high, but it is high by French standards, is what they term Hill 70. A lot of the fiercest fighting takes place on that summit on the 25th. There's a half-finished German redoubt up there, and time again, they force their way in, they're forced back. The fighting goes on there most of the day before by the end of the day, by the light is falling, the men are entrenched on the reverse slope and clinging on to what they have. These few hundred yards see some of the most intense fighting that we've known up to this period. In front of the Lawns Road redoubt, the dead Highlanders and Black Watch tartan lay very thick. In one place, about 40 yards square, just in front of the enemy's wire, they were so close it was difficult to step between them. But General Thully commented on the unconquerable, irresistible spirit that the survivors had possessed to be able to force their way through and onto the hill. It truly was remarkable, bearing in mind that these men had been civilians only a few months earlier. And to give you an idea of the cost, coming out of action that day, the 9th Black Watch have about 90 men. A few days later, by the 27th, they had mustered 8 officers and 326 men. The colonel, the second in command, are the only 2 officers who come back. The others were made up from those who had been left behind as a detail at the back at the depot. Out of the 326 men, 250 had been through the battle, and about 60 of these had been wounded. We went into action with 20 officers and 900 other ranks. The best part of 1,000 men go into action that day, and only a handful come out unwounded. The Black Watch, the 9th Battalion, suffer the heaviest casualties of any battalion of the regiment in any conflict. But the interesting thing is when Stewart says, "But we upheld the traditions of the regiment." This idea of regimental tradition, history, prestige, it's very much ingrained. It's in there. It's part of their character. The image there actually shows the courtyard of what becomes known as Blackwash Farm at Mazengarb. That was where the men stayed before and immediately after the battle. And to give you an idea, actually, of the extent of the casualties, the losses, this is 4th Platoon of the 9th Black Watch. Again, prior to going to France, May-June, sorry, 1915. So there's roughly, estimate about 60 odd men in that photograph. This is 4th Platoon after the battle. You've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 men or so who have come out of the battle and wounded. It really just hammers home, I think, the significance, the sheer extent of the losses that they sustained that day. Remarkable that they managed to achieve so much. But when we look at the speech that was made by the colonel, and we're bringing this to a conclusion here, but the speech that the colonel makes to his men, the remnants of his battalion, immediately after the battle, he talks about how they could look on themselves as worthy descendants of the great parent battalions, the 42nd and the 73rd. You'll look back on this with conscious pride that you've proved yourself trustworthy and upheld those great traditions. But on the first day that the 9th Battalion goes into action, they wrote themselves a fresh and glorious page in the history of the regiment, and what more could man them desire? I think it's quite interesting that they keep going back to this idea of regimental, the past glories of the regiment, and how they're upholding them in that present conflict. Major Stewart, who is on the right of that photograph there, in a letter to his son, he wrote, "We've done our job all right, and the enemy know what the Black Watch can do. It was some fight, old boy." To his wife, he described the Black Watch as absolutely magnificent, and they've written a page of history that will rank with Ticonderoga. They're always conscious of the regiment. Incidentally, if you cast your mind back to the photograph you saw of these two men in an earlier slide, in a space of a few months, I would say, they've both physically aged quite dramatically. These are both men in their 50s, both former regular officers, both retired, who are recalled for service in the First World War. But it does take its toll. And this is a battalion before leaving France. These are the men who sign up to do their bit, to stand for the glories of comrades and form on past battlefields and so on. This is Salisbury Plain shortly before the regiment leaves for France. And sadly, by September, this is where many of the men would lie. This is Philosoph Cemetery. And you can see the front row of graves. Virtually every grave in that front row has a Black Watch badge. All men of the 9th Battalion, all men who were killed on 25th September. And this again is from a visit I took several years ago with Black Watch veterans. Dud Corner Cemetery. Dud Corner Cemetery named because there were many dud shells found there after the war. But this was the ground that the 9th Battalion attacked. Major Stewart writes about visiting the battlefield a year after the battle, and still on the battlefield picking up discarded red hackles that had been lying there, that had fallen there in September 1915. And many of the graves on the far right, and the pillars at the far right, are the Black Watch names to those who've no known grave. But many of those who enlisted in that first photograph, sadly, have spent their eternity here. And just this last quote I wanted to leave you with. The men of the 9th Black Watch, Kitchener's New Army, they'll be remembered as long as the Black Watch is a regiment. 42nd, you have every reason to be proud of your 9th Black Watch, your 9th Battalion. Major Stewart wrote that in his diary on the 27th September 1915. The significance of the pedigree. You can see it in this photograph. These are men, the veterans who are in this photograph, with their blue bonnets and their red hackles. You know, the significance, the history of the regiments, it runs deep. It's very much it's ingrained. It's in the heart. And this photograph, I'll leave you with this one. This is an image of the old barracks in Perth, which sadly is no more. There is a memorial stone. If you're ever in Perth, you can visit the stone. But this shows the Lewis commemoration. Sometimes after this is in the 1920s. But for Lewis, for Scotland in general, Lewis was a very auspicious event, one to be commemorated. In most towns, most villages commemorated Lewis in some way. The only one that still does is Dundee. On the 25th September each year, Dundee lights the memorial beacon on Dundee Law on the hill. You can still see it if you go over there. They're the only town who still mark this event. But the 25th September did loom large in Scotland's calendar in terms of memorialisation, and it was a huge event. And if I could finish up before questions, apologies, I know I've gone on a little bit, but just wanted to flag these two publications. I'm not twisting your arm, but if you are interested in the history of the regiment, these are two books that I've been involved in over the last few years. The Black Watch and the Great War book has been published. The other one will be published next year. And I just mention them simply because any proceeds from the books are filtered back into the Black Watch Regimental Association, which allows them to continue their works of comradeship, heritage, and charity. So we are quite keen It was very much the idea that lay behind the books to support the regiment in its endeavours to support veterans and their families. So, if you are interested, please, I'd be delighted if you check those out. Thank you.
Well, absolutely marvelous, Dr. Patrick, a very sobering and pride-evoking presentation. I'd like to open the floor to discussion, please, I'd like to ask everyone to turn your cameras back on and unmute. And please, let's engage in some discussion, question, answer with Dr. Patrick.
Can I ask a question? Or actually, I have a couple of questions, Professor.
Yeah, sure do, yeah.
Major John Stewart, you referred to him several times in your presentation. Is that Major John Roy Stewart?
No, this Major Stewart was I think a different chap entirely.
Okay.
They may have had some connection, but he's quite an interesting figure because he goes on to become quite the historian, and he writes a history of the regiment, I think in 1912, something like that. He's also quite a prodigious collector of all things Black Watch, and many of his, or parts of his collection, can still be seen in the Black Watch Regimental Museum in Perth. So he's quite an interesting figure. His letters and diaries are all available in Perth to be viewed. He seems quite an interesting chap. I don't think he would have been the easiest man to get along with, to be honest. But a very interesting character, put it that way.
My second question, if I could, I'll get mine out of the way real quick here. My family has a great military tradition, but more with the Gordon Highlanders and the Royal Engineers. We had casualties, deaths in the family in both the First and the Second World War. And I've been trying to research mainly my grandfather and his two brothers who were in the Royal Engineers and the Gordon Highlanders. And I've been told over and over again from people in Scotland that most of those records were destroyed in the fires in London in the Second World War. And I'm having, pardon my French, but a hell of a time trying to find anything. I have their military numbers and that sort of thing, but I really can't find anything else. And was wondering on your research, how did you research all this?
It can be tricky. Individual service records, and yeah, I've run against that, so I hit my head against that brick wall many times, and you'll be told that obviously, roughly 2/3 of the records were destroyed in fires, and I think that's absolutely true. They have digitized the surviving records and they've made them available through various websites, Find My Past, Ancestry, and so on. For the men whose records don't survive, it can be quite tricky. It sometimes depends on individual records or individual museums and archives. And we are quite lucky with the Black Watch because they have quite a comprehensive collection. For the Gordon Highlanders, I don't know, have you had a chance to contact their museum? Because they seem
Yes,
quite
I've
good at
actually been to the
Scotland.
museum, actually,
Right,
yeah.
yeah. So it sometimes can be quite tricky for individual soldiers. The only other thing I would maybe suggest would be, pension records. And those have been digitized and available through various, I think again through Ancestry possibly, or through the Western Front Association. And while they won't often tell you a lot, they will occasionally, if someone was wounded or discharged or sadly killed, there will be some record as to what the parents or the wives and the children were actually granted as a pension. And from my own side of the family, from my great grandfather's side, I find it I found it quite useful to corroborate and verify addresses and next of kin details. But I'm afraid it didn't tell me a lot about the individual. It's a bit of a lottery, I'm afraid, with certainly with the First World War.
That's quite a shame.
Yeah.
Your great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And
Thank you.
hopefully I'll see you in Perth next August at the games.
Absolutely. That'd be, yeah, wonderful.
What's the status of the Black Watch now? Does it still exist?
It does and it doesn't. In 2006, they officially, I think, as an individual regiment, ceased to exist and they became part of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. So
Mm.
they are currently 3rd Battalion Royal Regiment of Scotland. So
Mhm.
they still wear the red hackle. Um, Ostensibly, they are, they are, I suppose, an extension of the regiment. But the regiment is is a separate entity, as a regiment in their own right, ceased to exist in 2006.
Mhm.
But the tradition, the reputation is continued by the Royal Regiment of Scotland.
Well, it very well should be.
Mm. I think it was a great shame that many of these regiments, which had such a fantastic history, lineage, pedigree, over the years, due to I understand the military has to be reformed, and I understand things change, but I
Mm.
always found it a great shame that some of the names like the Argylls, the Seaforths, Camerons, and so on were in some respects lost. I thought it was a great shame. Not only Scottish regiments, but English regiments too. My grandfather was served in the Cheshire Regiment, and sadly the Cheshires are now long since gone too. But
Mm.
yeah,
In the War of American Independence, the 71st Highlanders, the so-called Fraser's Highlanders, were very active in the Carolinas.
Mhm.
And there was a large Highland Scot settlement in several counties of southeastern North Carolina. Even one of the high schools there is named 71st High
Mm.
School. Most people who even live in that area have no idea where the word 71st came from. But it was an affection of the local Highlanders after the war to name the school 71st.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, and certainly the Black Watch spends some time in North America, in the States. I didn't mention the Wars of Independence or War of Independence, largely because we come off the losing side, I suppose. But the many of the men who serve are given the option of taking their discharge in America, and a good number of them settle there. I had an old PhD student, not old PhD, some time ago, a chap called Richard Lutzenheiser, who was researching quite a lot of this, and he was looking at the connections of these men who had taken their discharge in America and had, married, raised families in the States, and this whole idea, this extension of diaspora. It's absolutely fascinating.
Well, I'm very delighted you've shared your books with us, Dr. Patrick. I, for one, will be ordering the available one, and as soon as the other comes out, anxious
Thank you.
to read.
Yeah, thank you. The thing we did with those, we actually, while myself and Fraser Brown, who himself, Fraser was a former Black Watch soldier and one of my PhD students as well, um, we encouraged, and we had a number of veterans who actively contributed to those volumes too. So it was great. This whole idea of the regimental family that I alluded to earlier. For the Black Watch, the regimental family extends to those who've served or the families of those who've served, and it's quite inclusive. But it was great to be able to do those books with men who had and women who'd been actively involved with the regiment over a number of years, and it just really enhances that kind of family feel. It's really good.
I have a Harris Tweed Black Watch coat that I wear.
Well,
Other questions and discussion, please. Don't be shy.
Let me just add in a comment. I was in the Middle East. This would have been 2004, 2005, and on a reconnaissance trip from Kuwait going up into Iraq, ended up bivouacking overnight with one of the members of the current iteration of the Highland Regiment. And he identified very, very distinctly as being Black Watch.
it's still a thing, because you've got these families who, fathers, sons, grandfathers, further back, who've all served. And I think that was something you find that the you want to serve in the same regiment as your father did, and it's a thing. You know, you get to, when you go to the museum in Perth, you become aware of many of the veterans that you meet, and you know, they'll tell you about, you know, my granddad was in the Somme and stuff like that. You know, it's absolutely fascinating. You know, you've got that kind of real tradition, which I think to some extent we can maybe we're in danger of losing to an extent. But I think, you know, the more we could kind of keep that, the better.
Yeah. The night we spent a good portion of time, and he was actually surprised I knew some history of the Black Watch. The next morning, before we split on our different recon paths, ended up giving me one of his red hackles.
Mm.
A fond souvenir.
The thing is, there's a lot of people, you know, there's a lot of misnomers about the regiment too, because I mentioned Culloden, but there's you'll regularly find sort of popular history where people tell you the Black Watch were at Culloden and stuff like that. They actually they weren't. They were in Kent at the time. They were brought back to the Britain because of that. But you know, I think again one of the reasons that we wanted to do the books was try to get the story of the regiment out there, because despite the fact that they are such a big part of Scotland and arguably Scottish identity, there's still a lot of areas that people don't know, and a lot of myths get trotted out all the time. So yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Well, I would say bravo. Very,
Yeah.
very well
very cool.
done. We can't thank you enough. And we are about to run out of time. But I just want to thank everyone that participates in this forum every month. You are keeping Scottish history and culture alive, and the traditions. And please pass it along to people you know, and ask them to join in. We have excellent speakers every month, like Professor Derek Patrick, and it's just an honor and a privilege to be able to listen to them and to benefit from their knowledge and research and labor. So, Dr. Patrick, we thank you. I'd like to wish everyone happy Christmas, happy holidays.
And for you, Connie.
And we will see you in January.
Thank you.
Be
And thank you
safe.
very much for
Presentation.
and thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation.
Very,
Thank you.
very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Christmas.